The early morning sun of late February, 1943, cast a pale glow over the dusty Tunisian plain near Kasserine. A column of German half-tracks rumbled slowly along a pitted road, their engines coughing against the desert wind. Behind them, the smoke of the recent battle still hung like a bruise across the horizon. Amid the wreckage of burnt-out vehicles, one shape stood out squat, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably foreign. A captured American tank, its olive paint scarred but intact, sat motionless under the fluttering palm trees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The white star on its side had been hastily overpainted with a black Balkenkreuz. Its new temporary crew, a mix of Panzer IV veterans and maintenance officers from the 10th Panzer Division, circled it in wary silence. The machine was a Sherman, an M4A1, variant abandoned after its crew had been forced to retreat. Its presence drew quiet fascination. The Germans had heard rumors of these new American tanks arriving in North Africa in growing numbers. Few had seen one up close. Fewer still had driven one. A lieutenant named Franz Dörner, formerly a Panzer III commander, climbed up the side of the tank and peered into the open turret. "So this is what they send their crews into battle with," he muttered, brushing away soot and sand. "It looks crude." His tone carried the casual arrogance, typical of a Wehrmacht officer trained to believe in German mechanical superiority. For years, German propaganda had presented American industry as clumsy, capable of quantity but not refinement. That belief was not mere arrogance, it was doctrine. The Wehrmacht's entire approach to mechanized warfare rested on the assumption that precision outweighed volume, that engineering mastery and crew skill could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Since the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 40, that philosophy had been vindicated again and again. German tanks, from the nimble Panzer IIs to the emerging Tigers, had consistently outperformed their enemies. But the tide of war was changing, even if few at Kasserine yet sensed it. The American entry into the conflict had introduced an industrial force unlike any the Axis powers had ever faced. By early 1943, U.S. factories were turning out nearly 2,000 tanks per month. For every Panzer the Germans could produce, the Americans built 6. Yet among German tank crews, such statistics were dismissed as irrelevant. "Numbers don't win wars," Dörner's commanding officer, Oberleutnant Ernst Weber, had declared during a briefing days earlier. "Engineering and discipline do." It was this mindset that made the Sherman before them so intriguing and, for some, unsettling. A Panzer mechanic named Kurt Meinhardt circled the vehicle with professional curiosity. "Look here," he said, tapping the bogie suspension with his wrench. "They use vertical volute springs, not interleaved like ours. Simpler, but sturdy." Another mechanic joined him. "Crude, yes, but easy to maintain," he admitted reluctantly. The Germans were not accustomed to simplicity. Their tanks were masterpieces of complexity, overlapping road wheels, finely tuned engines, and transmissions requiring trained specialists to service. By noon, the order came down from battalion headquarters. The Sherman was to be recovered and made operational. German intelligence officers wanted it driven, tested, and evaluated. The desert would be its proving ground. When Meinhardt and his men opened the rear engine deck, they were greeted by a compact radial engine, the Continental R975. To their surprise, it was not an inline or V-type engine, but a 9-cylinder aircraft-derived radial, air-cooled and arranged in a circular pattern. Meinhardt blinked. "An aircraft engine? In a tank?" he muttered. It seemed absurd. German engineers had long dismissed such configurations as inefficient for ground vehicles, but the logic of American design was not the same as theirs. They spent the afternoon clearing sand from the filters, topping off oil, and checking the starter. When they finally turned the crank, the engine roared to life with a deep, steady rumble, loud but smooth. The Germans exchanged glances. Weber climbed up and shouted over the noise, "All right, take it forward." The driver, a volunteer from the 10th Panzer's maintenance platoon, engaged first gear. The Sherman lurched ahead, tracks clattering over loose stones. The movement was unexpectedly smooth. The driver, used to the stiff gearboxes of German tanks, called out through the open hatch. "It shifts easily, no double clutching." He shifted up again, and the Sherman accelerated across the sand. Its wide tracks spread the load evenly, gliding over soft terrain where Panzer ETIs often bogged down. When they stopped, the crew exchanged looks of disbelief. By the time the sun dipped low behind the ridges, the verdict among the mechanics was unanimous. The machine was far from perfect, its armor mediocre, its gun outmatched by the long-barreled Panzer IVs, yet it ran. It simply worked. That evening, as the men gathered around their campfire, Dörner wrote in his notebook, "We have captured an American tank of curious construction. Its power unit seems unorthodox but dependable. Simplicity appears to be its guiding principle. I do not understand how such a machine can function so effectively when built with such crude components. There is something we are missing." He was not alone in that thought. Similar reports had already begun filtering through German lines across North Africa and the Eastern Front. Captured Shermans and Grants were being shipped back to Germany for evaluation. What began as curiosity would soon become something deeper, a quiet unease within the Wehrmacht's technical branches. For the first time, they were forced to confront the possibility that American design philosophy, the pursuit of practicality over perfection, might represent not inferiority, but a new kind of strength. In the weeks that followed, the captured Sherman at Kasserine would be assigned to the 10th Panzer's technical detachment. It would be fueled, tested, and driven hundreds of kilometers under conditions that would have broken most German vehicles. And as each day passed, its new temporary crew would come to a realization none of them had expected, that reliability, once dismissed as a secondary concern, could be the most decisive advantage of all. The desert wind had shifted overnight, carrying a cool breath from the north. By dawn, the camp of the 10th Panzer Division's maintenance detachment was already stirring. Mechanics moved like silhouettes through the mist, their voices clipped and businesslike. The captured Sherman sat at the center of it all, its broad hull washed clean of sand, the improvised German markings freshly painted. What had been a curiosity the previous day was now officially designated for testing. Its new name, scribbled on a clipboard, read, Panzer M4A1, Versuchsfahrzeug NR. 18 captured tank, test vehicle number 18. Lieutenant Franz Dörner stood beside the tank, with a sheaf of papers under his arm. The forms bore the insignia of the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army's Ordnance Department. They outlined a standard test procedure: engine endurance, suspension travel, gunnery accuracy, and maintenance interval assessment. To most German officers, these were dry bureaucratic requirements, but Dörner knew this evaluation mattered. The reports compiled here would travel far, possibly even to Kummersdorf, the High Command's secret testing grounds outside Berlin. "Fuel her up and warm the engine," he ordered. The crew complied. The radial roared to life once again, that deep aircraft-like growl cutting across the morning stillness. The sound turned heads. Even those who had mocked the Sherman's simplistic design found themselves intrigued. It was louder than a Panzer IV, yet somehow steadier. As the engine idled, Dörner reviewed his notes. According to captured U.S. manuals found in the tank's storage box, the M4's Continental R975 produced 400 horsepower, roughly equal to a Panzer IV's Maybach HL 120, but with fewer moving parts. The Americans seemed to prioritize endurance and field serviceability over refinement. In theory, it was a compromise. In practice, it might prove an advantage. By mid-morning, the test began. The Sherman was driven onto an open stretch of desert cleared for vehicle trials, a mix of sand, rock, and shallow wadis. Meinhardt, the mechanic who had first started the engine, took the driver's seat. Dörner rode inside the turret, his notepad wedged between a radio set and a box of 75mm shells. "Begin at half throttle," he instructed. The Sherman rolled forward easily, its suspension flexing over uneven ground. "Remarkably smooth," Meinhardt called through the intercom. "No jolting in the controls." After 5 minutes, Dörner ordered a turn. The tank pivoted on its tracks with surprising grace, throwing a thin plume of dust. The steering levers moved lightly, far easier than the stiff, hydraulic-resistant controls of a Panzer. Dörner jotted notes. Driver reports reduced fatigue, transmission response consistent. They drove for 2 hours straight, covering nearly 30 kilometers without incident. When they stopped for inspection, the oil temperature and cylinder pressure remained within safe limits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meinhardt wiped his brow. "Astonishing," he said. "No leaks, no overheating. The German trucks accompanying them had already paused twice for radiator checks. At noon, Weber, the commanding officer, arrived in a staff car. His expression was skeptical. "How does it compare to our Panzer IV?" he asked. Dörner hesitated before answering. "It lacks refinement," he admitted, "but it compensates in reliability. The transmission runs cool. Maintenance is simple. The Americans have sacrificed elegance for functionality." Weber frowned. "That may suit them. They fight with factories, not skill." But Dörner's mind was already racing ahead. He remembered what a fellow officer had once told him on the Eastern Front. The Russians fight with machines that refuse to die. The Sherman, he realized, might be America's version of that principle, a tank that could be abused, repaired, and sent back into battle faster than any panzer could. After a short rest, they began the endurance trial, a 75-kilometer run across mixed terrain. The Sherman charged through loose sand, its wide tracks distributing weight evenly. Panzer IVs often dug ruts in soft ground. This one glided. When they reached a stony ridge, Meinhardt downshifted and climbed steadily. Even with its high center of gravity, the tank maintained traction. "Observe," Dörner said to Weber as the tank crested the ridge. "Minimal track slippage, no suspension failure." Weber leaned against the hull, watching it descend the far slope. "Perhaps luck," he said flatly, "but luck does not win wars." By late afternoon, the vehicle had completed the run without a single mechanical issue. Dust caked its tracks, but the components held firm. Dörner opened the engine bay again, half expecting to find oil leaks. There were none. He could not help but smile. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he wrote his report by lantern light. The American M4A1, though crudely manufactured, demonstrates a level of operational reliability unprecedented in our experience. The machine tolerates extended use with minimal maintenance. Ease of driving suggests reduced crew fatigue in long operations. However, armor thickness is inferior to Panzer IV standards. Gunnery trials will determine whether its 75 mm can compete at medium range. When he handed the report to Weber the next morning, the older officer skimmed it with mild disapproval. "You sound impressed," he said. "I am impressed," Dörner replied. "It functions like a soldier's weapon, not an engineer's dream." Weber said nothing, but in his silence lay an unspoken truth. The German army's faith in mechanical perfection was slowly being challenged. A few days later, they conducted gunnery tests. Ammunition crates from the captured Sherman were unpacked and examined. Each shell was marked with bright yellow stencils, 75 mm M61 APCBC. The German testers studied them closely. The projectile looked unsophisticated, with a blunt nose and simple ballistic cap. Dörner loaded one into the breech. "Target! That derelict Panzer III hull at 800 meters, he ordered. The gunner adjusted his sight. "Ready. Fire." The recoil jolted the turret. Smoke filled the air, the echo bouncing off the distant rocks. When the dust cleared, the observers saw a neat hole punched through the Panzer's frontal armor plate. Dörner raised his binoculars. "Penetration confirmed," he said quietly. The men around him exchanged uneasy looks. "Try 1,000 meters," Weber called. Another shot roared out another clean penetration. The Sherman's 75 mm, though not a high-velocity gun like the German KWK-40, proved disturbingly efficient at typical combat ranges. Its explosive shells were especially devastating against infantry and light vehicles. By the end of the day, Dörner's logbook contained a simple note: "Gun adequate for all standard engagements below 1,200 meters." That evening, a courier arrived from divisional headquarters carrying new orders. The captured Sherman was to be transported to Tunis for further testing under controlled conditions. Dörner and Meinhardt would accompany it. Weber, reluctant but obedient, approved the transfer. As the tank was loaded onto a flatbed trailer, Dörner climbed one last time onto its hull. The desert wind whipped at his coat. "You know," Meinhardt said beside him, "if this war lasts another year, we'll see hundreds of these." "Thousands," Dörner corrected softly. When the convoy rolled out, the Sherman's shadow stretched long across the sand, a dark symbol of what was coming. The Germans still believed they could outfight the Allies through precision and experience. What they did not yet grasp was that the battlefield itself was shifting, from the realm of tactics to the realm of production. And the Sherman, crude though it seemed, was its herald. The convoy reached Tunis after 3 days of slow travel. Dust storms delayed them, and the roads were pitted from constant Allied air raids. When they finally arrived at the testing grounds outside the city, a former French artillery range, now controlled by the Wehrmacht, the captured Sherman was unloaded beside a row of Panzer IVs and a single Tiger I, recently arrived from Europe. The sight of the three tanks together was striking, the Tiger immense and imposing, the Panzer IV lean and purposeful, and the Sherman broad-shouldered, oddly utilitarian. The testing facility itself was little more than a scattering of tents and workshops, but among its personnel were some of the German Army's most experienced engineers, men who had evaluated everything from British Matildas to Soviet T-34 seconds. When they saw the American tank, curiosity turned quickly to skepticism. "Another mass-produced toy," one engineer remarked. "They build them like tractors. Perhaps that is their strength," another countered. The tests began the next morning under the supervision of Oberingenieur Wilhelm Kessler, a civilian mechanical expert assigned to the Wehrmacht. He had spent years studying foreign armor and prided himself on impartiality. "Let us begin with the basics," he told his team. "Disassemble the transmission, the engine, and the turret ring assembly. Document everything." For 2 days, the Sherman was stripped to its mechanical heart. Panels came off, components were weighed, parts catalogued. The German engineers noted every measurement. The transmission gears, though roughly machined by German standards, were thick and durable. Bearings were sealed, not exposed a small detail, but one that meant dust and grit could not easily foul them. Kessler scribbled notes into his report. Manufacturing tolerances appear generous, crude but resilient, likely assembled rapidly, perhaps even in the field. The crew compared it with the Panzer IV beside it. The German gearbox was precise but fragile. It required constant adjustment. The Sherman system, by contrast, tolerated abuse. It reminded Kessler of American trucks, vehicles, designed not for specialists, but for ordinary soldiers. On the 3rd day, they examined the tank's cast hull. Unlike German tanks, which used welded plate armor, the M4A1's hull was molded as a single piece. The Germans had long considered casting wasteful and imprecise, but as Kessler ran his hand over the smooth contours, he frowned thoughtfully. "This is efficient," he admitted. "A single mold replaces dozens of weld seams. Less labor, faster production." A younger engineer looked skeptical. "But the armor is soft." "Soft, yes," Kessler replied. "But it is enough. And the shape deflects shells as well as thicker plates would." These small realizations, one after another, began to erode the old confidence that German engineering was supreme. The next series of tests involved mobility and fuel endurance. The engineers filled the Sherman's 660-liter tanks and charted its consumption across a 100-kilometer run. The results shocked them. Despite its bulk, the M4 consumed less fuel per kilometer than expected, almost equal to the lighter Panzer IV. The radial engine, though unconventional, proved remarkably efficient under steady throttle. When the test concluded, Kessler read the gauges twice to be sure. "I do not understand how they achieve such economy," he murmured. "This design defies our expectations." One of his assistants offered an explanation. "Perhaps their fuel quality is better. American gasoline burns differently." "Or perhaps," Kessler said, closing his notebook, "they have simply accepted that perfection is unnecessary." By week's end, the testing ground became a quiet arena of reflection. The soldiers and engineers who once mocked the Sherman now treated it with a kind of wary respect. Every inspection uncovered something infuriatingly practical. A tool stowed where a man could reach it easily, a spare part mounted within arm's length, a hatch that opened smoothly with minimal effort. The Sherman's interior was cramped but logical. German tanks, by contrast, were labyrinths of levers and cables. In one test, Kessler invited 2 Panzer IV crewmen to sit inside the Sherman. They examined the controls, the vision blocks, the radio mountings. "Everything feels simple," one said. "Even the periscopes can be replaced without tools." "Yes," Kessler replied. "A crew could repair this tank under fire." The German engineers began to grasp a truth their doctrine had ignored. Ease of use was a weapon. Meanwhile, the Allied air raids intensified. Each night, the testing ground was shaken by distant explosions. The Germans grew accustomed to the dull thunder of bombs falling on Tunis. It served as a grim reminder that the war outside the workshop walls was being decided not by individual machines, but by production. lines across oceans. Still, they worked methodically. They performed firing tests with German ammunition to measure compatibility. They examined armor penetration angles and slope resistance. They even painted one Sherman panel in desert camouflage to test heat absorption. Every trial added to a growing dossier titled Erfahrungsbericht, Amerikanischer M4 Mittelpanzer, Experience Report, American M4 Medium Tank. The report's language was precise, but increasingly uneasy. Phrases like acceptable tolerance and adequate for combat requirements replaced earlier sneers about inferiority. Kessler's private notes, never intended for publication, were more candid. If such machines can be built faster than ours, the strategic consequences are dire. Quantity, when paired with reliability, becomes its own form of quality. By mid-March, Dörner was summoned back to the test site. He found Kessler pacing beside the now fully reassembled Sherman. The tank looked almost proud, its new German cross painted neatly over the old star. "We are conducting comparative trials today," Kessler said. "You will drive the Sherman against a Panzer IV." The course had been laid out across a stretch of uneven terrain marked with flags. Each tank would complete the circuit twice, once for time, once for mechanical endurance. The crews mounted up. Engines started with twin roars, Maybach and Continental growling in unison. "Begin," the observer shouted. Both tanks surged forward. The Tiger crews watched from a nearby hill, taking notes. Dust billowed behind the two machines as they raced across the field. The Panzer IV gained an early lead, its powerful engine propelling it quickly over the first rise. But within minutes, the Sherman's smoother suspension began to show its advantage. It handled bumps with ease, maintaining speed where the Panzer slowed to avoid jarring the tracks. At the halfway mark, the Sherman pulled ahead. Its driver, Meinhardt, again grinned through his goggles. "She likes to run," he shouted. By the finish line, the Sherman had completed the circuit nearly 40 seconds faster. Its engine temperature held steady. The Panzer IVs, meanwhile, ran hot and required a coolant check. The German observers compared notes in silence. Kessler broke it first. "The American tank performs better than anticipated. Its design sacrifices precision for practicality, yet achieves efficiency. We must reconsider our assumptions." That evening, Kessler invited Dörner to his tent. Over a tin cup of coffee, he spoke quietly. "Do you know what this means, Lieutenant? It means they have solved the problem we refuse to admit exists. They have built a tank that can be maintained by anyone. We build machines that require devotion." Dörner nodded slowly. "And devotion breaks under fire." They said nothing for a while. Outside, the wind hissed against the canvas. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft guns opened up another raid over the port. Later that night, Dörner walked alone among the silent tanks. The moonlight gleamed on steel. He stopped beside the Sherman, resting his hand on its hull. It felt solid, unpretentious, a worker's machine. He imagined rows of them rolling off assembly lines in Detroit and Chicago, each identical, each destined for a battlefield. He thought of Germany's factories, bombed nightly, struggling to repair the losses. He whispered to himself, "We are losing not to soldiers, but to engineers with factories that never sleep." When the tests concluded a week later, the results were compiled and transmitted to Berlin. The official summary was cautious. The M4 medium tank demonstrates acceptable performance and notable mechanical dependability. Its powertrain, though unconventional, offers sustained operation under desert conditions. Simplicity of construction suggests rapid replacement capability. Overall assessment, moderate threat, if employed in large numbers. But the unspoken conclusion among those who tested it was far less moderate. They had glimpsed the future, one not defined by perfect machines, but by perfect systems of production. The captured Sherman was left behind when the Axis forces began their retreat from North Africa in April 1943. It was too valuable to destroy, yet too cumbersome to transport. Dörner watched from a distance as it was camouflaged beneath netting, its engine drained, its turret locked. For a moment, he felt as if he were burying a prophet no one wanted to hear. Within weeks, Tunis fell. The Germans who had studied the Sherman were scattered, some captured, others reassigned. Yet the lessons they had learned would not vanish. Copies of their reports reached Germany, where engineers at Kummersdorf and Henschel read them with growing alarm. One comment in particular, penned by Kessler himself, circulated widely. The American tank's greatest strength is that it need not be the best. It only needs to exist in overwhelming numbers, each one reliable enough to fight another day. Those words, written in the fading light of a lost campaign, would echo far beyond Tunisia. Spring of 1943. South of Berlin, at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, snow still lay in the shade of pine trees. The war had turned uncertain. Reports from the Eastern Front spoke of brutal losses at Stalingrad, of Soviet counterattacks rolling west. In this atmosphere of doubt, a battered American tank arrived by rail from the docks of Hamburg, a captured M4A1, marked with faded Afrika Korps symbols and sand still in its treads. The transport crew had been ordered to deliver it intact to Heereswaffenamt Prüfwesen 6, the Army Weapons Testing Division responsible for evaluating foreign armor. Engineers and officers gathered as the Sherman rolled down the ramp. Its olive-drab hull looked strange against the grey snow. Among the observers was Oberstleutnant Heinrich Becker, a senior technical officer recently returned from the Eastern Front. He had seen the T-34's impact firsthand. Now, he wanted to know if the Americans had achieved something similar, a weapon that was not elegant, but unstoppable. Begin full evaluation, he ordered. Powertrain, suspension, turret rotation, speed, armor, angles, everything. The test director nodded. It has already been driven in Tunisia. These are the same reports we received from the Afrika Korps. Becker flipped through the pages, frowning. Then let us see for ourselves. For the next 3 weeks, the Sherman was subjected to exhaustive mechanical trials. It was driven across mudflats and icy roads. Its engine started cold each morning and left idling for hours. German technicians monitored every gauge. The Continental radial engine, though designed for aircraft, ran smoothly, even after long periods of strain. The fuel system proved tolerant of lower-octane gasoline, a fact that impressed even the skeptical engineers accustomed to the delicate Maybachs of German tanks. By the 5th day, one of the technicians, a former Daimler-Benz specialist, remarked quietly, "It runs like a truck, a very good truck." Becker's assistant smirked. "That is not exactly praise." "It should be," the man replied. "Trucks win wars." When they disassembled the transmission for inspection, the results mirrored those from Africa. The herringbone-cut gears showed even wear, minimal pitting. The clutch plates could be replaced in minutes. The oil filter was accessible without tools. Everything about the design screamed serviceability. The German engineers found this both admirable and infuriating. Their own machines were masterpieces, over-designed, over-tuned, and nearly impossible to repair under fire. Becker had seen Panthers immobilized by a single snapped track pin. The Sherman, by contrast, seemed built for punishment. A report from the Kummersdorf Abteilung für Fahrzeugtechnik summarized the findings bluntly. The M4 is an example of functional industrial design, not optimal in armor or firepower, yet exceptional in operational readiness. Components are standardized, interchangeable, and robust. Maintenance demands are low, crew training minimal. Becker underlined that last sentence twice. It was the one that troubled him most. At the same time, Germany's tank designers were deep in crisis. The Panther program, meant to counter the Soviet T-34, was beset by delays. Factories struggled under Allied bombing. Precision machining, the pride of German industry, now became a liability. Each Panther required weeks of skilled labor, and even then, half left the assembly line with defects. When Becker brought the Sherman findings to a conference at the Waffenamt headquarters in Berlin, the reaction was tense. Around the long oak table sat engineers from Henschel, MAN, and Daimler-Benz. Charts covered the walls, filled with production statistics and failure rates. Becker cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, the Afrika Korps tests were accurate. The American tank is not a masterpiece, but it does not need to be. It only needs to work. Always." An older engineer scoffed. "Reliability is a poor substitute for performance. The Panther's 8-centimeter gun will destroy any Sherman before it comes within range." Becker held up the report. "And how many Panthers can we field this month? 40? 50? The Americans build 2,000 Shermans in that time, each one reliable enough to move, fight, and survive." The room fell silent. The numbers were irrefutable. Even as Allied bombing intensified, American production only grew. By mid-1943, Detroit's lines were building more tanks in a month than Germany could in half a year. A representative from the Ministry of Armaments finally spoke. "We cannot outproduce them. We must outthink them. Superior technology is our only path. Becker shook his head. Technology without reliability is vanity. Ask any Panzer crew stranded in the mud. In private, the Kummersdorf engineers spoke more freely. One remarked, "It is as if the Americans build for the war they have, while we build for the one we wish we were fighting." Another replied, "And that difference will kill us." Their reports circulated upward, reaching even Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. Speer had long argued for simplification and standardization, but the German industrial machine resisted change. Each company guarded its designs, its tolerances, its pride. The Sherman, by contrast, was the embodiment of unity, one blueprint, thousands of factories, interchangeable results. Becker summarized the lesson in a private memorandum. The strength of the enemy lies not in individual excellence but in systemic cohesion. Every component, from the bolt to the engine, serves the greater purpose of function. This philosophy, not the machine itself, is what we must fear. That same month, German intelligence intercepted reports of new American tank variants, improved Shermans with thicker armor, better guns, and diesel engines. It became clear that the Allies could evolve faster than Germany could react. In July, a demonstration was arranged for senior Wehrmacht officers at Kummersdorf. The Sherman was pitted against a Panther prototype and a captured T-34. Observers gathered along the ridge, their greatcoats buttoned against the chill. First, the Panther roared to life, its Maybach engine bellowing, its turret swinging smoothly. Then the T-34 followed, clattering forward on its wide tracks. Finally, the Sherman rolled out, engine humming evenly. Each tank was driven through the same obstacle course. The Panther's performance was spectacular at first, fast, powerful, elegant, but halfway through the trial, a coolant line burst. Steam hissed into the cold air. The vehicle halted, disabled. The T-34 continued without issue. So did the Sherman. At the finish line, both idled side by side, their engines steady. Becker turned to his colleagues. "There," he said quietly, "that is the war in miniature." After the demonstration, the officers discussed what they had seen. Some insisted the Panther's mechanical failure was a minor defect. Others, weary from years of attrition, saw something more. "They have mastered the art of sufficiency," one colonel said. "We chase perfection and lose the race." Weeks later, Becker was reassigned to the Eastern Front. Before leaving, he walked once more through the Kummersdorf yard. The Sherman sat under a tarpaulin, awaiting further tests. He ran his hand along the fabric, feeling the outline of the turret beneath. He thought of the men in Tunisia, of Kessler's notes, of Meinhardt's grin as the tank raced across the desert. He thought of the factories in America, endless lines of workers assembling machines that would never break down long enough to give Germany a chance. "Reliability," he murmured, "is the truest form of power." When he boarded the train east, he carried with him a final copy of the report, a document stamped Geheimkommando-Sache, secret command matter. It would vanish into the archives of a collapsing empire, but its conclusions would outlast the Reich itself. In later years, Allied researchers reviewing captured German records found Kessler's and Becker's writings bound together. Their tone was clinical, but between the lines ran a quiet astonishment. Both men had recognized, long before the war ended, that Germany's defeat had been engineered not on the battlefield, but in the factories through the relentless logic of function over form. The Sherman's reputation after the war would become the subject of endless debate. Soldiers who fought in them called it dependable. Critics called it underpowered. Yet in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the mud of Italy, and across the beaches of Normandy, its reliability proved decisive. For every German tank that broke down, 10 Shermans rolled on. At Kummersdorf, the last remaining test Sherman was scrapped in 1947. Its parts were melted into steel for civilian machines, tractors, cranes, rail cars. In a way, it returned to what it had always been, an honest, working machine. And in the quiet ledger of history, men like Becker and Kessler were vindicated. They had seen clearly, if too late, that wars are not won by brilliance alone but by endurance, repetition, and the humble certainty that when the engine turns, it will turn again tomorrow. The year was 1946. Germany lay in ruins, not the clean kind of ruin left by time, but the jagged wreckage of a world that had burned itself to ash. Cities once mapped by light and order were now outlines of smoke and silence. Among the rubble of Berlin, a man in a worn overcoat moved carefully between shattered walls, his steps measured, his breath visible in the winter air. Heinrich Becker had survived the war barely. Captured by the Americans in Saxony, he had spent months in an internment camp, answering endless questions from intelligence officers about tanks, designs, and production methods. He had told them everything, not because of coercion, but because, in the end, he wanted to. The war had ended in the very way his final report had predicted, through mechanical certainty, through numbers, through function. When he was released, there was nothing left to return to. The Kummersdorf proving ground was a crater. His family's home in Dresden had burned in the firestorm. He lived now in a single rented room above a bombed-out bakery. The landlady charged little, she pitied him. Every morning, Becker walked the ruins, as if taking attendance for ghosts. He still carried his old fountain pen. The brass cap was dented, the nib bent, but he refused to discard it. It was the only thing he had left from the years before everything fell apart. He sometimes wrote in a small notebook, though the words no longer had a purpose beyond remembrance. One cold afternoon, he received a letter stamped with an American seal. It was brief. Your former colleague, Ernst Kessler, is being held near Augsburg. Civilian status, pending review. He requests permission to correspond. Becker sat with the letter for a long time before replying. When he finally wrote, the words came slowly. Each line waited with the silence of years. My dear Kessler, I am still in Berlin, or what is left of it. The tanks we studied have long since been melted into plowshares. I walk past children playing in the streets where panthers once rolled. I sometimes wonder if they are luckier than we were, born into ruin but not guilt. Write to me, if you can. Tell me if you still dream of the desert. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived, written in Kessler's familiar looping hand. Berlin, I can scarcely imagine it. Here, the Americans treat us fairly enough. They ask questions, mostly about engines and materials. I told them, you were the one with real understanding. They laughed and said perhaps they will recruit us both when they rebuild Germany. I do not laugh much anymore. Do you remember that day in Tunisia, when the Sherman roared past us? I still hear it sometimes, that sound of inevitability. Becker folded the letter and placed it beside his notebook. For the first time in months, he felt something close to warmth. The two men began exchanging letters regularly. Their correspondence became a kind of refuge, a private archive of regret, curiosity, and reluctant admiration for the enemy who had defeated them so completely. Kessler wrote of the American technicians who came to question him. They are efficient, he observed, but not cruel. They seem more interested in what we learned than what we lost. Becker replied, perhaps that is the final lesson. They build, we refine. They produce, we perfect, and it was production that won. As months passed, Kessler was moved to a camp near Munich, where former engineers were recruited to assist in reconstruction projects under Allied supervision. Becker received an offer to join as well, not from guilt or pressure, but from a pragmatic realization that rebuilding was the only work left. He accepted. When they met again in late 1947, it was not in uniform but in plain work coats, standing among blueprints for water pumps and tractor engines. Their handshake was quiet, almost embarrassed. Kessler looked older, thinner, his hair turned grey at the edges, yet his eyes still held that restless spark, the same one that had glimmered when he'd first examined the captured Sherman years ago. So, he said softly, the engineers of the Reich now build for peace. Becker smiled faintly. Machines do not care who they serve. Perhaps that is mercy. They worked side by side for months. Their team designed a compact diesel engine for agricultural use, simple, durable, cheap to produce. The Allies encouraged such designs. Germany needed function, not prestige. For Becker, it was strangely liberating. He no longer had to chase perfection. He only had to make things that worked. One evening, after work, they sat in a small cafe lit by a single bulb. Outside, snow fell in thin, uncertain flakes. Kessler stirred his coffee and said, Do you ever think about the Sherman anymore? Becker chuckled. Every day, though now I think less of its gun and more of its engine. Strange, Kessler said. We hated it. We mocked it. But it was honest. Becker nodded slowly. It was built without vanity, and that is why it endured. They fell silent. Around them, the cafe hummed with quiet conversation, people rebuilding not just their homes, but their dignity. In the following year, Becker was invited to write a technical paper for a British-sponsored conference in Hamburg. The topic was industrial standardization. He hesitated at first. The idea of lecturing to those who had once bombed his cities felt bitterly ironic, but Kessler urged him to accept. "If they ask you to speak," he said, "then speak truthfully. It may be the only thing we have left to offer." At the conference, Becker stood before an audience of engineers from across Europe. Many were former enemies, others, young men untouched by war. He spoke in clear, deliberate German, his voice calm but heavy with experience. "We once believed that superiority lay in precision," he began. "We built machines that were magnificent, intricate, and doomed. The Allies built machines that were sufficient and therefore unstoppable. What we called simplicity was, in fact, wisdom. What we called mass production was, in fact, unity of purpose. Let us not repeat the arrogance of mistaking elegance for strength." When he finished, there was polite applause. One British engineer approached afterward and said, "Your words could have been written by an American." Becker smiled faintly. Perhaps they were written by defeat. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, he received a telegram from Kessler. It read, "Heard your speech went well. We are not who we were, but perhaps we are who we should have been." In the years that followed, both men faded quietly into civilian life. Kessler took a position with a small engine manufacturer in Stuttgart. Becker joined a research institute that studied industrial efficiency under the new Federal Republic. They met once a year, always in the same cafe, always ordering the same bitter coffee that neither quite liked. Their conversations drifted further from war. They spoke instead of design, of philosophy, of the strange peace that came from knowing one's work might now feed instead of destroy. Yet even in peace, the past remained an uninvited companion. In 1951, Becker visited Kessler's workshop. On the wall hung a framed photograph of the desert, the one taken in Tunisia before everything changed. Below it, Kessler had placed a small brass plate engraved with a single word, Verständnis, understanding. Becker looked at it for a long time. "It suits you," he said. Kessler smiled. "It suits us both." As the years rolled on, the letters grew fewer, the handwriting shakier. Becker retired in 1958. He spent his final years in a small house outside Potsdam, surrounded by books, his old reports, and the hum of distant trains. Sometimes he would take out the copy of the Kummersdorf evaluation, the one stamped Geheime Kommandosache. The paper had yellowed, but the words still carried their quiet defiance. One evening, a package arrived from Stuttgart. Inside was a short note from Kessler's widow. "My husband passed peacefully last month. Among his papers, he kept your letters. He said you were the only man who ever understood what the war truly taught." Beneath the note was Kessler's notebook, the same one he had used during the Sherman tests. The final page held a single sentence in his careful script. "Reliability is not weakness. It is truth made into motion." Becker read it 3 times. Then he closed the book, set it beside his pen, and stared out the window at the evening sky. The world beyond was quiet, no searchlights, no engines, only the soft rhythm of peace earned through exhaustion. He thought of the machines that had defined his life, the Tigers, the Panthers, the Shermans, all gone now, replaced by tractors, lorries, and the endless hum of rebuilding. For the first time, he realized that the sound comforted him. When he died a few years later, the local papers printed a short obituary: engineer, educator, advocate for industrial reform. There was no mention of tanks, of war, or of the lessons carved into steel. But those who had known him understood. His legacy was not in what he built, but in what he finally learned, that progress without humility leads only to ruin, and that sometimes the simplest design carries the deepest truth. In a museum decades later, one of the surviving Shermans stood on display, polished, silent, eternal. A small plaque read, M4, a 1 medium tank, symbol of reliability. No one who visited knew the names Becker or Kessler, but their ghosts were there, watching quietly, their understanding woven into every bolt, every weld, every machine that refused to stop working. And somewhere, deep in the echo of history's great engines, their lesson endured, that endurance itself is a kind of grace, and that in the ruins of pride, the simplest things are the ones that last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.